Happy to be here. Thanks again for coming out today. My name is George Ransom. I already got a question before I even started was, are you a lifelong resident of Walpole? No, I'm not. I have spent 42 years plus here, and I do happen to live on Plimpton Street in Plimptonville. So we've had a chance to do a lot of work with the Historic Society and some of the former and retired members of the Historic Society. I would like to acknowledge Betty Cottrell helped me out a lot when I did the first Plimptonville video in 2000. And then we had some research done by Frank Larrabee, who happened to live on one of the prettiest streets in Walpole, Beech Street. And he did some research on farms in Walpole and has some information on windmills in Walpole. And then we have a couple other documents, one by Teddy Haguler, who did some research on farms in Walpole. So some of the early work done by people in the society and the Walpole Historical Commission, which are different and have different responsibilities, came into play. We started off with the question, how many barns are there in Walpole? And I've driven around a lot. My kids grew up in Walpole, so I thought I knew quite a bit or had quite a bit of a sense of how many there were. I had no idea how many there were. So my first sense was to go to look at some of the research we saw in the Historic Society, and then second, to go on the internet, and I looked up other cities, towns, and states that have done research on barns. And I found a survey that Pennsylvania did on their barns, and they have a slew of barns due to all the farming communities there. So they did a survey on barns, so I took that and we used that as a model to send a survey out to all the people in Walpole, finding out about their barns. How old were they, how much history they had, how much history they knew about them, where they're located, how they were used, what was grown there, what animals were there. So we used that as a jumping off point. My next stop was the assessor's office, and all of the bonds and all of the items on people's property are assessed at a value. So I went down there and they printed out a nice sheet for me of all of the bonds that were located in Walpole that were being taxed at the time. This was 2017. And so we used that as how many numbers of people have bonds and what type of bonds they were. So we'll go into that a little more fully, but that was a little bit of the background. I won't go into the survey. It's self-explanatory, but I was very surprised by finding out there were 128 bonds that were being taxed in Walpole in 2017. They're on 2017 now. A couple of them have been demolished, torn down, and part of the rebuilding. But I was a surprising number. So then I said, well, how am I going to picture those? So I had my iPad, drove around the town, looked up, picture from the street. I didn't go on anybody's private property, but we have quite a few pictures and quite a few stories to tell. The good thing about doing these programs is somebody in the audience always has a story to tell, to elaborate, to expand, to correct, to help out, including spelling errors and things, but they can add to what we have. So this was one of the bonds that we saw out that was across the street on Lincoln Road, that they were going to put some soccer fields out there. So I'd been by it, and a couple of the kids on the soccer teams we coached lived by there. So it was beautiful, really. And I see the sign on the farm there, Glenview Farm, 1785. So that probably was the oldest barn in Walpole. So the owner of the property said, I'm afraid not. It burnt to the ground in 1960 and was rebuilt. So that's the kind of thing that happens every time you do these presentations. So I'm glad to have participation and see what information we have. Also, there were a couple of legislators who came to the presentation, and they were helping draft some legislation that would allow for some rehab funds, money, and services to be allocated for people to rehab the bonds, because obviously they're pretty expensive to have rehabbed. Other facts and information will go along as we go through, but This was a pretty good replica of what was there years ago. We also wanted people to send in a survey form. They did that. We also did the online thing too, so people didn't even have to move other than sit in front of the TV and punch a few buttons on the computer, which was helpful too. But people came down, they showed us some pictures, they told us some stories. A couple of people were rebuilding their barns, looked at the old mortise and tennis joints, and so that was good to see those. We also had one barn that on a Friday night got demolished, unbeknownst to anybody, without a permit, so that raised a bit of controversy, so we'll talk about that. But the Historic Commission's responsibility was to help preserve what's in the town, so you can't take anything down without getting a permit, and a permit go through the permitting process. So that was helpful for preservation. So, get us started. Introduction, the spirit of America in the countryside, barns. All right, barns should indicate a good life and an idea that they were shrines to that are to be remembered. They were part of our vanishing heritage now. And somebody asked me how many farms there are in Walpole. Well, I'm not really sure there's any farms anymore, but there were a lot of subsistence farms and farming practices done here in Walpole. We'll talk a little bit about some of the local barns and all the pictures I have. I have 78 pictures of barns in Walpole to show you. I also have pictures of barns that are lived in, that have been transferred to living space, and a couple of them. Just recently, the homestead was sold. Betty Golding, many of you know, longtime teacher in Scott. Betty moved and now sold the house to the next door neighbors, and she had a birthday party for a one-year-old son, so we had a chance to go through the whole house and the glorious barn out there, which was heated, had chauffeurs' quarters, had a 2.5-story big cupola. You know, it was really a treasure to get in and see those kinds of things. So I'm going to give you an example of some types of barns and how they were used and what they were used for. So this is a bank barn, banking on the side of a slope so that you can get underneath and store and take manure out on a wagon. This is a Dutch barn. It's mainly used in upstate New York, where you could drive an old wagon through the barn. It could be ventilated, and that's one we saw quite frequently. This is another barn, another example of a crib barn, which was mainly for the storage of barn supplies and food, mostly food. A round barn. There was one round barn here in Walpole, but most of us equate the round barn to the Shakers. And they have a number of round barns, and if you've ever been out to Hancock Village out west or other parts of the country, you've seen the round barn, and it's spectacular to see. And some of the other barns were designed to help us with the weather, and these were the overhangs on the barns, and when we had hinges, we could open and close doors easily, and larger significant hinges where, as you see the wagon right there, could be unloaded and loaded from first floor, second floor, and upstairs. Here's a round barn. It's 16, it's actually not round, it's 16-sided, so it goes around. There are no posts in the middle of the round barn, which surprisingly saves a significant amount of lumber. There's several Victorian barns in Walpole, and used to be Joe LaRusso's, I think it's John Domenico's now, house right next to the old library. There's a beautiful example of an old Victorian-type barn there that's been made into a pool house. They have a big pool out back there. Some of us get invited to some of those parties in days gone by. But it's a beautiful, classic Victorian-type barn with ornamentation and everything on it. Big problem for barns was fires. So if you had hay storage in there, you had animals locked in there, tremendous amount of heat was likely to build up, and so they needed a way to vent them and also to keep from the lightning from striking. So here's an example of a standard lightning rod on a barn with a beautiful vent. Out west, they had long barns, primarily for cattle, and so these were seen mostly out west, and they could be a couple 100 feet long, and they were mainly storage of cattle. This is a standard barn, more elaborate barn. It's red. We'll talk a little bit about why they were all red, but you can see a significant cupola. The upkeep in that was fairly recently done, and you'll see a lot of doors for the second story storage of grain, but also storage of machinery on the sides. These have some sliding doors on both ends. So why red? What is it about red? Barns have been red for 200 years. So barns were extensively painted red because red was readily available, and as it was a mixture of red pigment, skin milk, and linseed oil. And that was created by DuPont, and he identified that as red or boxcar or caboose red. But also, the theory was that farmers suffered from a saturation of green. There was nothing but green around them, the green hills, the mountains, the land, and they needed something red in there to kind of break all that up. And so that was part of the red. So barns have been traditionally painted red. Some of them were left, if they were shingled, with just a clear shingle on them, unpainted. And once in a while, we see some dairy barns that almost exclusively would be white. All right, so this is a wind barn, and a picture taken 100 years ago or so, a little more than 100 now. But it is a significantly large structure, and there are no beams on any of the inside of the barn the way it was constructed with the arched roof. Here's an ornate wind barn. You can see lots of ventilation, fancy electric vent system where they would draft the hot air up and out, along with all the doors and windows. It is on a bank, and you can see that it's oftentimes used for cattle. This is a western barn type thing, and you can see that the hinges with lots of doors and some side buildings off there to house animals and storage of machinery and farm equipment, and the horses. So weather vanes became part of the adornment on the barn. So if you were a fairly well-off farmer, you might have a fancy weather vane made for your barn. Here's a picture of the inside of the round barn and the framing in it. It's really interesting to see. I mean, it looks like to me, it looks like an awful lot of work to build those, but they used, the belief was that they used considerably less wood during a time when wood was in shortage or high cost. They were able to do it with less wood. Metal roof cattle barns were, as I said, out west where they had lots and lots of cattle, and so they were housed in single-story barns during different seasons in the corrals alongside. New England types of barns. So now New England has a identified as a New England bank barn, and it's on the bank of a road, so you could, with the large door on the side, so you could drive your wagon up into the barn, unload hay and other materials in there, and they had stalls for horses on there. You still see the vents, and you can see the manure stalls underneath the barn, and they also had a couple of storages for other animals there, pigs. So this doesn't have a formal support to the bank barn, but it is made of wood, so they could get the carriage in there. Many barns, if they had horses, they had a tack room. So there were a number of barns here in Walpole that still have beautiful tack rooms for all the riding equipment necessary. If you go down to Pennsylvania Dutch country, you'll see a Dutch stone barn. They lasted a lot longer. They were a lot better shape because of the stone foundation. They weren't built on a rubble foundation. And some of the New England bank barns had later on cement put in there, but initially they didn't. So this is a Dutch barn that has multiple doors and the traditional, as we identify as Dutch colonial style roof. And they had the most storage readily available up top. Sugar house. So we have some maple sugar houses, mainly in Vermont. I think there were a few in Massachusetts. But they have a large open area because they boil down and have a significant number of fires going in ovens to boil down the sap. And that's their primary and total use is sugar production. So this is, you can see some of the hinge details of this barn. It's in a measure of deterioration at times, but you can see how the siding is put on, and you can see that there's some open areas and some venting done with the hinges. Not only do we have barns, but other associated parts. This is a water tower that was built, and farmers also needed water for some of their animals. And so we have a water tower here. So this is a vented bank barn. This was around 1860, 1870 because of the significance of the railroad. And they started to use railroad type ties to connect and slide the barn door open so one person could just go slide it all the way open and drive in. But it's a typical New England bank barn. And you see there's two other little sheds or other outbuildings alongside of it, primarily probably for pigs and for maybe chickens or other small domestic animals. So here's a close-up of the sliding doors covered by the weather so that the metal wouldn't rust as quick, and slide it open and close. What are some of the outbuildings that are here in Walpole? Probably not a lot in Walpole, but you're going to see ham houses down south, machine shops. On one of the Plimpton properties down back, there's a machine shop and an old farmer's house that was there. Water tower, chicken coop. When I bought my house, there was a chicken coop there. Nut house if you're down south. Smoker houses where you're, smoking meats. Outhouses, root cellar. There's still a root cellar over on one of the Plimpton properties. A privy, a wash house, woodshed, and an outdoor oven. Silos. So silos were added around 1900, and they were initially built by vertical board and batting, and hung together by wires and hoops. And they weren't very stable, but they did bend with the wind as they were going by. And now we see them replaced by metal and a cement foundation. So here's an example of the overhang on the red building. You can see how significantly red this is. This is a significantly sized barn. It's not a home barn. It's most likely a commercial barn. And we did differentiate along the way commercial barns from family farm barns for, where a farmer was doing subsistence for his family and selling a few products. Here's the same barn while it was doing rehab. So before, the 80-year-old barn looked like this afterwards. So they can be saved, they can be preserved, and they created quite an impact in the community. So here we are with the red paint again, obviously because it was inexpensive. I was surprised to see that there was skim milk added into it, so I don't know what that did to the chemistry of it, but it did. This is a long open barn, usually out west for cattle. So building materials, what were some of the barns made out of? Well, obviously wood. We see some made of brick. Many of them had fieldstone foundations. Some of them had cinder blocks, and some of them were adobe bricks. Later on, we see cement used to make the foundation on the barns, or at least underneath the barn, so it could be easily cleaned. Later on, after 1800, we see that cut nails were used to build them rather than the mortise and tenon old how to do your barn built by yourself and maybe a local craftsman. So some of the tools, an axe, a mallet, a chisel, an auger, all hand tools, all done by a single person or, probably a craftsperson in town with the help of a farmer. There weren't architectural plans for barns that we found around. Some of the barns had wooden cedar shingles for roofs. We had a lot of cedar here in Walpole. Some of them had metal roofs, thatched roof, and then some of them had asphalt shingles on the roof and the sides. Here's an example of a western barn with the extension on it. It looks like a flying airplane almost, but you can see how expansive that was. We can see some hay on the side. Another western barn, not colored red. So some types of roof, and to help us date some of these barns, there were styles that were popular in certain time periods. So we can see there was the gambrel roof, and you can see the structure there of the gambrel roof, where the gambrel offers you the most storage upstairs without any obstructions of walls and beams that needed to be supported with the foundation and things. Okay. Here's obviously a New Jersey barn, but has an addition on the back where various farm equipment and storage is necessary. Then we get to another classic New England type barn would be the connected barn. We still have some of them in Walpole, some of them right down on Main Street, and the issue was the weather. The weather was really bad at times. You couldn't get out often, so you never had to leave your house, your barn, your shed, your wood shed, your washing house to get into the barn itself. So the animals could be taken care of without the weather issues. So here's an example of the floor plan of some of the houses with the kitchen, a main barn, and then we have a smaller barn, and the last one in the end is a shed. Round barns were first seen in America in Hancock Village out in the western part of the state, and it's been well preserved since it was first built, but they were primarily built by the Shakers. So why do they build round barns? Well, interesting fact was there were no corners to hide the devil. So without corners, the devil couldn't hide in the barn. So that was one of the superstitions that promulgated the forcing of the round barn. They also used 30 to 50% less lumber. Many of them are local areas, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and some of them were made of stone. And this is a diagram that you can see where you go in the round barn, you dump off some of the hay, it gets stored, and it gets pushed down to the animals down on the lower level, similar to what a bank barn would be like. We talked a little bit about the grain storage in a silo. So this is a board and batten silo, and you can see with the wind, you could actually tip it. Here's a sketch of another type of sugar house. Pretty much, many of them had the same kind of design up in Vermont. Mainly Jefferson, Vermont has a lot of them. So here are some other buildings related to the sugar house. So a corn barn out west where they grow corn, and it's as far as you can see. You can't even see a tree. You can see hundreds of acres of corn. So they had corn barns or corn cribs developed out there where they just stored corn next to the field. So here's one with two kind of a drive-through. Other than Dunkin' Donuts, you can drive the cattle through and get a corn. Open up the sides. Now, cupolas became famous in a lot of towns. It has a function and also a utility. So there were a number of cupolas that were designed, and you can see some of the West Barnstable one there. And what else do we have? We have Connecticut Valley types, an ice house cupola, and they were very popular. All different types of doors. Once we have craftsmen involved, they made some pretty interesting.
That's from Eric Sloane's book, right?
Pardon me?
That's from Eric Sloane's book?
Yes, it is. And why was he so famous? He's not so famous for the book, but he's a very famous artist. And so he did all of these pencil sketches, pen and inks for our development. So here are some pictures of some of the typical tools that may have been used in the development of your barn. Mortise and tenon, chisels, augers, small axes, hatchets. Now we're looking at the other outbuildings. A wash house is in Virginia where the heat is oppressive at times. Next we see a portable pig house. Down on the Plimpton or the Lewis Farm, there was an extensive pig house out in back. It was probably 75, 80 feet long, made out of stone. So Mason did the sides and top. Recently, part of the top and caved in a bit, but it was significantly, I was surprised at how long it was. So it's probably 75, 80 feet long. Chicken coops, wood sheds, farm equipment storage, and various other buildings, the ice house. Barns also became popular because they're right near the highways, and so we see massive advertisement. So they would pay the farmer to be able to advertise on the barn. Here's the feed. And as Carl West pointed out, the image book that Eric Sloane had was primarily used to kind of get an update on barns. So, drive around in my car, take some pictures, and we worked with the Historic Commission. I was on both at the same time, and my iPad gave us a number of pictures. So this is out on North Street. This is Hillcrest Farm. It's now condos, and the extensive barns are now driveway and storage for I think there are 4 condos out there now. But a wonderful reuse of a property. This is the Calvin Plimpton house, or the homestead. Probably the most significant barn in Walpole. 2.5-story, the cupola, right next to a little swimming pond. And they used to have a bridge across the Neponset River over to those fields on the other side of the river where they grazed cattle. So on the Plimpton house, they drove sheep and other animals across to the open fields there. This is the Carriage house on 42 Plimpton Street, which was a carriage house, as the name said, or I identified it as. And it was originally a carriage house with the Plimptons, maybe George Arthur Plimpton, when he lived on the farm. And below the carriages and up above later on, besides storage, when I moved in 1979, it was a family lived up on the top floor, and still the carriages were underneath. 2 architects bought the house around 1980, and they commenced to redo the whole barn, the whole bottom and the top included in one house, and put a little addition on the back of it. So that's a magnificent change of scenery there for that house. This is another house on Walpole, in Walpole, East Street, right next to the Lewis Farm. And this barn is mainly a horse barn, or it has a beautiful tack room in it, and it's well kept. I'm not sure why I did this one. I just took a bunch of pictures at times, but this is the house right next to me. I live in the corner of Plimpton and Hemlock. So this is a new house built up there. And originally, there was a commercial septic system business run out of the house, but this would have been a, you know, what an updated version of a new barn might look like. And a landscaper owns it now, so he runs a landscape business out of there. This is 224 Pilgrim Way, and this is East Walpole, and what's stored in there but antique cars. So the owner had 6 bays in there, and he stored antique cars in there. So you can see it's the building off to the right, not the 2 garage spots there. So it's down and back. It's pretty big. This is Fisher Street here. A beautiful barn in tremendous condition. North Street again.
Sorry.
That's fine. Another separated barn on North Street. I think this property just sold fairly recently. There's another barn with on North Street. North Street had quite a few barns. It's got horses in it. There's horses out back there you see on the side, yeah. So, this is across the street from that big barn, and these are 2 stables that were recently built, and there are horses out there, and there's a paddock area. This is on North Street, a little further up the street, and this is a significant barn because there's all kinds of farm machinery there. It's all woodland behind it, but it used to be a big farm area. Little New England barn tucked away behind there on North Street, going up the hill a little bit. This is the stable that was just recently done. It's a metal stable on North Street, and this is the one that's valued over $1 million, probably a lot more than that now, but a couple years ago, that's what the value was assessed for it. So there's about 4 or 5 barn-type buildings connected to that, in addition to the stable. And that used to be a hunting club out there, as I was told years ago. Yeah, here's one of the parts of the building. Another part to do with the barn and the extension, probably a chicken coop there. That's not a great shot, but it was getting close to dark. But be careful on North Street, so I took a quick picture. But it's a very extensive barn. So it's the biggest one in Walpole, and it's brand new. I also didn't include the Aggie School. The Aggie School is 200 and some odd acres of beautiful, pristine land here in Walpole, where we have 500 students in the educational process of agriculture and or related businesses. And they have just recently done over several new barns out there. So besides the new stable they put out front near the pond, there's a significant stable back there. Another barn. This is the Nightingale Farm on North Street. It's one of my favorite here. It was Sunny Rock. And if you have access to a computer, you can see the demolition of the barn on YouTube. So I actually, luckily, was able to see, not luckily, but was able to see it when it was being taken down. And it was kind of a sad day. So I guess it was from what I understood, a big family squabble that led to, you know, who knows what, but the farm is no longer there. And, you know, when I lived in the city all my life, so coming out to here and seeing, whoa, all that land and the farm, and that used to be the center of the 4-H club out there. So now I think the 4-H has moved over to Sharon, if it's still here. So they had a number of barns out there, and so if you want to look on YouTube, you'll see the demonstration of what it takes to get rid of a barn. All right, this is a nice example of the New England barn, well kept. The granite posts holding it up, and you can drive right under it and load up the manure train. Another example of the same one. This one you could barely see, and it's still an old New England farm barn. still on High Street. I included this. It's one of the massive chicken coops out there on High Street. How many barns have been converted to houses? I knew about probably 2 or 3. A good friend of mine lived on the house on Beech Street that was converted. It was one of the Allen barns. The corner of 27 and East Street was identified as Allen's Corner, and all of the houses there. They've recently sold the one on the corner, and then across the street they've done a significant addition to the house, but there were barns associated with that. So 436 High Street was a barn. I actually had a chance to go in this one. It was for sale. It's connected to the house there, but it still was a barn converted to living quarters. It was actually beautiful inside. Still had some of the original beams, and you can tell it was done by an architect. With the big open windows, the whole area was open. There's some of the outbuildings there along the way in the same property. There's 4 or 5 of them there. Across the street, there's High Street. There's another barn out there. A lot of land out there. Now we move down to Common Street, right downtown. So Common Street was a barn. What was that used for before it was a... While it was a barn, what it was used afterwards? Anybody know? Walpole Country Day. My daughter attended it with Mrs. Davidson, and she, for 35 years, ran a wonderful daycare preschool program there in the town of Walpole. So it's fairly well done. And she also flooded the back during hockey season, so kids could practice hockey there. Almost right across the street is the Hartshorn property. This picture was taken when it was kind of a mustardy colored. Now it's black, and they shrunk the barn down a little bit, as I understood, and some of the other parts of the house. But Hartshorn is one of the older names of Walpole, who goes back years. This is probably the most elaborate, fully restored barn in Walpole, right out the street here from the senior center. And it's well taken care of. I think Jarvis owned it at some point. I'm not sure who owns it now.
I would love to get in.
Oh, we all would, I think. So, but we did ask that question, and several people did say we could come and take pictures. So this is a barn. I tend to not think it's a barn. It was still identified. It looked like some barn equipment on the outside, but it was a mechanic shop out on Lincoln Road. Still down the street in Lincoln Road, this is a classic barn that's been converted to, it's got a business up on the top floor, but attic windows in there. This is our Lincoln Street house. This is another one of those attached buildings, and down in the back there were several other barns that he has. So there's the connected part, open part, and then storage of other equipment there. There's still horses out there. Here's the barn out back, similar painting, well kept. Still on Lincoln Street, this is kind of a New England barn, not painted, cedar shingles. We go to kind of across the street, still on Lincoln Street, we see a beautiful new stable put up there with a corral for horses and a new house. This is right across from Longview Farm. So we didn't include Longview Farms. I don't know if there are any barns or any outbuildings on Longview Farms, but it was traditionally a farm. It had been used for the same purpose of children with difficulty being there. Right down the street from me on Hemlock Street is Beech Street. This is a kind of 1+ story barn. It's got part of the side near the window dug out, but it was probably to house one carriage and a horse. Right around the corner on East Street is another one of these tucked away. Maybe you wouldn't notice it unless you were walking, but this was a barn. Similar use. Now we go up the street, the Grasshopper Lane, still near the junior high school. And that's been beautifully done over now, and I think it was on the, I'm not sure if it was on the market again, but it's been fully included in both parts of the property as living quarters. So what are the houses that have been converted to barns? Well, 42 Plimpton Street, we saw the Carriage house. 24 Beech Street, we'll see my friend's house, who I happened to go in there years ago, and he told me it used to be a barn. I'm thinking, there's no way this could be a barn. I mean, it was a very, very, substantial house. So it had a lot of work had been done on it. You absolutely wouldn't know until he took me up to the attic and he showed me the, some of the roof timbers and things. High Street, one on Washington Street, 401 East Street. Common Street has a pool house, rec room, family room area. Common Street daycare. So this is the house that's been converted on Beech Street. It's a beautiful house, but you would never know that was a barn that was moved. A number of the barns in Walpole have been moved, and so a couple of people have told us about those, but that's on a nice piece of property and a real pretty street. Right down the street, a couple houses down, is another connected barn converted to living quarters. Another house, another barn that was there that's not there anymore. There's several new houses, but progress, not progress, I don't know. But certainly, this is a nice example of a barn. This one overlooks the Rainbow, beautiful pond area they have there, the golf course. Jones's Barn and Stable, not Kenny Jones, I forget his first name. This is the, let's see here. I think this is the one that is in kind of disrepair, but it's right next to where the Larrabee's house used to be, on Washington Street next to Beech Street, one house down, or one part of a house down. There's a question of ownership of it, and could you tear it down, could you not, but it's still there. That's the good news. Peekaboo look at formerly Joe LaRusso's and John Domenico's Victorian barn. This is a barn on South Street near where you would enter the forest, and it's a 2.5-story barn with a center cupola. Okay. This is, from what I'm told, on moving down to South Walpole, Washington Street, is where there was an antique shop years ago, right across the street, kind of on Washington Street, another connected barn. This is a beautiful looking barn from the outside. It looks well kept. Now we go down to Neponset Street, and it's not a barn. I guess it was, maybe, it did look toward that dimension like it might have been used for farming in later days. We're still on Neponset Street. The man house that was done over, that beautiful white house that was painted gray, which I'm thinking when he was doing it, I'm thinking, ooh, I don't know how it's going to look. It looks magnificent because they did a beautiful job with repainting the house. This is 72 Lewis Avenue, right down the street from Main Street. Betsy Dwyer is here too, so she's sitting over. She's one of our members of the Historic Society also. Do you have any information on this, Betsy, you can share with us?
Back when we were first getting...
Let me get you the microphone.
I don't know.
You don't need
Back when Walpole was getting its first door-to-door mail delivery, which at first was just to the rural outposts, it wasn't downtown. This is around the early 1900s, or early 20th century. This was a little outpost of the post office. We had one mail wagon and horse. He lived, I'm pretty sure, toward North Walpole. So the idea would he would come into town, find the mail here, sorted in a little mail room, and then set out with his horse and then leave it there. So it was being leased by him. I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you, that was very interesting. Next time. Wow, yeah, next time. Next part of the show. All right, here we are. All right, this is on East Walpole, 101 New England Connected Bond. And this is just a young mother just purchased this house and is redoing it. It's no longer, it's right in the corner of East where they have that big bend in the road. And she's done some work to shore up the bond. I had a chance to see the inside of it. It did need some work. It's got a beautiful cellar, but she's done a lot to upgrade the property. Kind of right across the street from us on East Walpole, when I first moved in, this barn was there, and there were a couple of horses. It's got the door up top on there, which is kind of unusual. But there were a couple of horses that were stored there. This was back 1980. Now we're on East Street, and you can see part of the barn there. The house was just recently purchased, and they had a tear down. They took down a couple of those trees there. But the barn looks to be, it's separate from the house, but it looks to be in very good shape, but it overlooks the golf course. So root cellars. Root cellars were part of life. We stored things in there before we had refrigerators. We also had a wet cellar, or maybe somebody might call it a spring house, but we had to store products and keep them either wet or cool or dry. And milk, cheese, and butter was stored in wet cellars. Dry cellars, we had various vegetables that would withstand the periods of a season indoors. And spring houses were water sources where water kind of flowed through them. I don't think there's any in town, but Betsy would know better than I. So this is a view of the house on East Street from the backside, where you can see it's a fairly small barn, but it would have been connected to what a family would have used to sustain their life in open fields. This is the Allen property. This went before the Historic Commission. The house was going to be sold, and the house behind it was going to be sold, and they needed to take some of the property so they could make it a, they own both lots, so they could make it a complying lot with the standard size requirements. So they had to cut off part of the barn, so they had they had to go through Historic Commission to cut off about 10 feet of the barn. So it's still there, it looks great. They did a good job with that. It took them about a year, and the whole house took a long time to sell, but it's been very nicely restored, and the paint and the work they did on it was beautiful. It was kind of a difficult house to go through because it really hadn't had a lot done to it in many, many years, but I'm glad they rehabbed it. Over to Union Street, there were some big farms over in East Walpole. This one was probably a Carriage house, and you can see the storage up top in the barn. On East Street, this is living space, as I understand, upstairs, and there's a sunroom on the flanking the side of it there. You go way out of town, almost in the near where the prison system is on Winter Street, and there are two big, beautiful new barns there. 25 Park Lane, for those who know, Park Lane kind of cuts through East Walpole, and this property was put together for a antique fire truck. So it's not technically a barn, but it in all appearances would look like a barn and could function as a barn. Right down the street, around from the monument in East Walpole, 1 Everett Street, this property was, was a lot that had probably 12 acres connected to it originally. This is Everett's property, and this was used for storage, and they still have a gas tank there next to it. This is on East Street heading up the hill toward town, and it's not a great shot, but it's a really expansive couple of barns. This is a horse barn that we talked about. Fanny Plimpton or Ann Plimpton house right next to the Lewis Farm. Now, we did the house tour of Plimptonville about a year and a half ago, and one of the things on the Plimpton farm, this was the original stable to the Plimpton estates in the Lewis Farm, pardon me. So the Lewis Farm ran goods from the farming product of 200 acres of land into Boston. So the story was that, you know, they would send some of their crops in, send the wagons into Boston during the day and come back with lobster at night. But it was more than well-to-do. Two famous Red Sox stored their horses out on the Lewis Farm. Carl Yastrzemski and Reggie, not Lewis, no, he's a basketball player, right? I'll think of his name in a minute. But so they had horses stored there, so they came down and used to ride out on the Lewis Farm. So this was a stable converted to, it was a 5 or 6 horse stable converted to living space, and the gentleman owns a very expensive antique shop in business over in Dover and Sherburne, and he's done a beautiful job of extending that house and making it a beautiful home. It's amazing. It's no longer here. This is Walpole Woodworkers, a barn, part of the Allen barn, that we tried to convince them to keep the barn. But they had other plans and wouldn't. So Walpole Woodworkers were the fixture in Walpole for, you know, almost 100 years. They did tremendous work. The problem was there was a lot of pollution on the property too. They weren't selling as much and didn't have as much cedar as they used to. The old cedar used to be, you know, very, very solid. And now some of the newer cedar is not as, not what it used to be years ago. So here's an example of some fancy cupolas that you could buy at the Walpole Woodworkers to adorn your farm, house. This is over in Kendall Street. And this was a beautifully restored barn with a side addition. Light Body owns this. He's done some electrical work. He got an electric. Some of the Light Bodies have electrical businesses there, but he's done a beautiful job restoring both the house and the barn here. And this was moved. He didn't know where it was moved from, but he knew it was moved. Just behind the Lewis Farm, and there's the old tractor that's still there, but there's the open field. This is a 919 East Street. It's still there, kind of a house and a barn or a building in need of a lot of rehab or repair. This is the house we saw before. This is the bank barn. This is a farm stand that was out in South Walpole. This is Betty Cottrell's and her husband's farm. Betty Cottrell was a avid gardener, and her husband also worked for George Arthur Plimpton on the Plimpton, the Lewis farm, and also worked in the Aggie school. So he had a lot of knowledge about agriculture. So she would tell us the stories that they would grow strawberries and other crops out there, and the train would stop by a couple times a day to drop off and pick up goods. So she sold some of her products back there when you could just stop the train and somebody could, you know, take on the strawberries and all the other products there. Pardon me for being in the shadow, but so there's the farm stand. This is on the same site. This was a silo that they had there. So I'm assuming there were some animals at some point kept out there. And there was quite an extensive flat area behind the house. This is my friend Frank's house out in South Street. This is a 1.5-story barn that was primarily connected to family farming. Another one on South Street, well-kept barn. This one you could barely see, but it's a Gambrell house on South Street. And I think this one's owned by one of the Light Bodies. This was over in East Walpole, across the street from couple of the restaurants there, and it's a very, very big barn, so I'm not sure who owned it, but what kind of farming was on there, but it was a significant barn. It's in very good shape. So some other information. It's hard to believe that 5 million people lived on farm plots in public lands. Well, when we first started this country, they were giving land away. They were giving, if you would farm the land, and they would give you land to farm and develop. So that's why the family farm plots. To backtrack a little bit, our farms were based not from when everybody came over from England and Europe, because in England, how many people have seen, what was the name of the movie, the video that we saw? I'll think of it in a second. But it showed the English types of farming where farmers did not own property. They had communal lots and communal property, and it was leased to them. All right? So that's where it came from. So they didn't own the barns. They were community barns, and the landowners owned the barns and farm, but you leased the property. So when we came to New England, everybody owned their own piece of property, and there were no community barns. So the community barns in England were smaller, and they didn't have a lot of storage. But we come here and we see that, every individual person could get and purchase land, build their own farm and barn as they needed. Next, heat raising from thatch, hay, electricity increased the likelihood of lightning strikes. So now we have vents and windows. Many of us who grew up in the 50s and 40s, we see some of the famous TV shows. If you've ever seen the show Witness, a beautiful example of the Amish building a barn, and hundreds of them coming out and working, toiling all day, and building these beautiful farm structures that are still here today, a couple hundred years later. Other TV shows, Bonanza, Boomtown, right here in Boston, Green Acres, Roy Rogers, Lonesome Dove, Wagon Train, all Little House on the Prairie, where I had two daughters that were fascinated by the living on the farm and the stories. My Friend Flicker, just to name a few of the bygone movies that were shows that were very popular about the American lifestyle of farming and living on the land. A barn owl. Barn owls are very useful for killing what? Mice. All the mice, millions of mice you have fed. So not pictured, Union Street, one on Elm Street. If you go out of town, on the left-hand side, before you hit Medfield, there's a beautiful example of the back of a couple of barns where you can see where they have the manure traps underneath, and they could just pull a wagon right up under there. A couple on West Street, Turner Drive, out by the Us House. We didn't include car barns, where if you've seen some of the old pictures, MBTA or the trolleys were all perpetrated to live in car barns as they were identified, but nobody in Walpole had any. We had a car barn out in South Walpole, but it's not currently on the books of any property, so there weren't any car barns here, but they were still identified. So what did we use? We used the Barn Journal, as we talked about with Carl, Age of Barns. Wikipedia, looked up a little history, the commission, help from some of the members of society. And as I've said, anytime we have a dairy farm, they were always painted white because of what? Milk, but tuberculosis. The tuberculosis scare was that the flies and the rotting manure caused tuberculosis. So they removed and dug out the barns, got rid of the manure, and had white, clean, cement bottom rooms to keep the cows safe. The end. But it's not the end. Outtakes. So Frank Larrabee, as we said, documented in 1895 windmills. So there were approximately 20 windmills identified in his survey, and I didn't know that they were taxed. So windmills were taxed. So they had to be productive, I would think. In 1892, there were about 20 farm-based, mill-based windmills in Walpole. Picture of George Arthur Plimpton on his ironworks with his carriages. Down. And that's it. So, if there's any questions or comments, or people want to bring up points? Yes.
Is there, one of the bonds that you showed was, Beech Street came on to Washington Street,
Yep.
and right there in the corner, is that the bond that currently has all the
Yes.
signs on it and everything?
Yes. Yeah. So, this is, I think her name is Cochran.
Yes, it is.
So she was, for years, a wonderful photographer for the Walpole Times when it was here. She was part of the Historic Commission when we did this. And her focus was to save that barn because there was a squabble between family members. The family members owned some of the property but wasn't sure, and could they tear it down, could we not? Her husband was a carpenter, and he's currently, I guess, fixing the barn up. So it's in repair now, so.
Because I think that was the house, and that during the summer, when things had to be outside because of COVID, they had a setup like a movie theater.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
could see from the street, they had a big screen and they were showing a movie.
Yeah. So, nice. Other comments from people? Bring back some memories of Walpole? Yeah. Yes?
At the early barns, did they have heat for the cattle or the
No.
chickens, or
No.
they did? What was the heat that they used?
They didn't have heat.
They didn't have any?
They didn't have any. There were stoves or, they're also very high. One of the things that happened in Walpole and many other towns, you had fires everywhere. You had fires all the time. So, the combustion, the heat, the, noxious fumes given off by the animals in the hay if it's deteriorating. They were highly flammable.
Oh, wow.
Barn after barn burnt down. Building after building burnt down. So they didn't have any heat.
So is that why they built, it looked like in the West, or the Midwest, they had metal barns,
Yes.
metal roofs?
Metal roofs, yeah.
So they must have had some kind of heat.
Well, I don't think so. I think they
No.
just kept the heavy snow off. The snow was, you get 2 feet of snow and it's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the snow is an insulator too. It can,
Right.
yeah.
So, but that's why they needed all the venting. Betsy?
Yeah, I was going to add something to the flammability of barns. I did a little research on first electricity in Walpole, and found out that a farmer might be suspicious. Might be suspicious of having electricity in the house. What do we need that for? But they would put it in a barn first because what's the alternative? A lantern that could tip over and catch fire. So some of the first households to be electrified in Walpole were barns.
Thanks for coming out. In the future, I was just talking with Debbie about doing a roundabout drive through the center of town, going over some of the old town buildings. We have 3 buildings in town that are on the National Register of Historic Places. So those will all be included in our drive-by tour. Yes? Yes. I would think so, yes. That would be included in what was a barn. Yeah. And there was a blacksmith in Walpole who had a trip hammer years ago. It's right out by where Anderson Electrical is, near the center of town. Yes?
I had a question. One of your photos, you had I call it a door to nowhere, like a second-story door that looks like a regular door. And I noticed they did that when they added the addition onto that house in Sharon on Norwood Street. They also put a door to nowhere on the second floor. Is there, I mean, what's the history of those?
They may have hauled things up there.
Well, beside that, but there's,
It's a real door.
it's a real door. That's the one on East Street you're talking about, yeah. Yeah, it's strange. I think it was a very economical way to just plug in a pre-made door, fill it in, put it up. I can put some hay up there for the horses over the winter. All right, well, thank you very much for your attendance and your questions.